Ladies and gentlemen, we are almost 3 years removed from the Seattle Kraken expansion draft of 2021. Now, Seattle has had some decent success since then, but I want to go back to that expansion draft and redo it completely, going through every team's pick and seeing how I would do it all the way in 2024. So today we're going to be going through what my Seattle Kraken roster would look like, presented by BetUS. So make sure you watch till the end as we go through every single pick to see what was wrong, what was right. And make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're new for more hockey content just like this all throughout the offseason. Now, going through the picks that were made all the way back in 2021, it's pretty surprising to see actually how many I agreed with. We saw Vegas having a stellar expansion draft, mostly filled by a lot of great trades. With Seattle, they did a pretty decent job, I would say, but I would have a lot of those picks different today. And in starting to build the Seattle Kraken in my mold here today, first we're going to start out with the Anaheim Ducks and who I would have chosen. Now, all the way back in that expansion draft, their first pick ended up being Hayden Fleury, a former 7th overall pick by Carolina, but he would only play one season there, playing 36 games, getting 4 points. Who I would pick instead would be Josh Mahura, recent Stanley Cup champion with Florida. Now, this isn't a huge upgrade by any means, but Mahura is a little bit younger, and I think at this point, he would have started to turn into a pretty solid D for Seattle. At least when healthy, he's been pretty solid over these past couple of years. I'd had a great 2023, being a big part of that Florida defense, and he likely would have been in the AHL or at least a 7th, 8th defenseman when it first started out, but I think eventually would have become a mainstay on the defense. Now, going on to the Arizona Coyotes pick, and there was not a lot to choose from here with Seattle. They ended up going for Tyler Pitlick, who didn't even end up playing a single game for them. I instead would have gone for Christian Fischer, who, although is not a much bigger upgrade, to me at least could have been a mainstay on that fourth line. You can see he got 27 points back in 2023 and could be a decent goal scorer for them. Again, nothing special, but a plug-and-play physical force. It's better than nothing, which is what Tyler Pitlick was for Seattle. Now, going on to the Boston Bruins picks, not a lot to choose from as well from this side, but the Kraken originally ended up going for Jeremy Lauzon, which I think was an okay pick. He only played one season for them, ended up going to Nashville then afterwards, and he's been an okay physical defenseman since then. I would have gone for Connor Clifton. I think as a physical D, he's been a little more successful, and of course this last year being with Buffalo still wasn't the greatest D in the world, but really we're splitting hairs here. It wasn't a big difference between the two. I would have gone Clifton though. Next up, actually going to the Buffalo Sabres pick that Seattle made. They went for Will Borgen, and I would have kept this pick. This is the first pick that I agree with Seattle with. We're going to pick Will Borgen as well. He's somebody that since he was brought in with Seattle has gotten bigger and bigger roles over the years, and this last year got 25 points in 82 games. He's someone that I think is really underrated two-way D, middle pair force for Seattle over these last couple of seasons, and we're going to keep him going onto the squad. Next up, and this is probably my first big hot take of the video, but we're going to go on to the Calgary Flames here. Originally, of course, they ended up selecting Mark Giordano, who would be the first captain, but would only play a year there and would later go on to Toronto. Instead, and we're going to explain why as we go through this video, I would have gone for Derek Ryan, who will fill the fourth line center position for the team. He's someone that I think has just been really good in that area over the last few years, being perfect in his role. He's going to have that role now with Seattle. Now we keep going, and next up we go on to the Carolina Hurricanes. Originally, the Kraken ended up picking Morgan Geekie out of them, and I think it was an okay pick. He did pretty well back in 2023 and has been a decent player as well for the Boston Bruins, but I feel like for Seattle, I would have gone for Nino Niederreiter. He had a year left on his deal with Carolina, and he's somebody that offensively, I think could have been pretty good in those early years. In 2022, he got 44 points, 24 goals. That could have been some much needed offense for their first year. So we're going to add Niederreiter to the team as a top 6 wing. Next up, we go to the Chicago Blackhawks, and this was also a really hard one to actually choose for because Nikita Zadorov was available, and I think under all means, he was the best player available that Seattle could have taken, and they ended up going for John Quinville, who's now playing in the National League, but I think I would have gone for Vinny Hinostroza. As we'll later talk about, I think the defensive options are pretty stacked here. Hinostroza, I think, could have been decent, especially back in 2022. He got 25 points, 13 goals with Buffalo that first year that Seattle was in the league, so he could have been decent as a bottom 6 winger perhaps, and maybe filling in for other injured players there when he needed to, bringing some speed, but it wasn't going to be a great draft from Chicago either way. Next up, we go to the Colorado Avalanche, and of course, originally the Kraken went for Jonas Donskoy. This one is really sad to talk about, especially considering I thought it was an okay pick, but the health really deteriorated after that. He had an okay first season with Seattle, but hasn't played a game since 2022. I think think knowing that, I think Seattle should have gone for JT Compher. He's somebody that, yes, hadn't really come up to that level yet. He got 18 points, 10 goals in 48 games in the year before Seattle came into the league. So it really wasn't something they could have foreseen. But since then, he's turned into a great middle six centerman. And I think he will fit that second line center role with us immediately in Seattle. Next up, we got Columbus. And this is another interesting one. They went for Gavin Bayreuther, which, I mean, sure, never played a single game for Seattle. I think we'll go for Max Domi instead. He, to me, especially on that left wing, being a little bit thin with the Seattle roster that I've cooked up here, Domi will be a big part of it. Offensively, we know what he can do, and he's somebody that, even though has had some inconsistencies, and in his last year at Columbus wasn't amazing or anything, I think he could fill that speed we need in that top six for Seattle immediately. Now we're going to keep going here, but first I want to talk about today's sponsor in BetUS. If you guys don't know already, BetUS is the place to be with this NHL season starting up. If you want to make your own picks on daily NHL games, futures in the NHL, trophy awards, Stanley Cup winners, it's all right here with BetUS. You also get an 125% sign-up bonus on your first three deposits up to $2,000. One heck of an offer there. Plus, with great payouts, great customer service, BetUS is the place to be. And you can see there's so many options here. You got total points on a bunch of different players. You can also go through the divisions if you're really feeling the Seattle Kraken for any reason. They right now have plus 1,400 odds to win the division. You can also go for the Stanley Cup winner and pick anybody you want. Even if you wanted to pick the San Jose Sharks like the sicko you are, you have the option of BetUS, and that's the best part about it. All the options are over there, and thank you so much to BetUS for sponsoring today's video. Now, originally from the Dallas Stars, the Seattle Kraken took Jamie Oleksiak, and that's exactly who we're going to take. I find that I actually agree with a lot of Seattle's defensive additions. Looking back on it, Oleksiak was a fantastic pick, but really the surefire pick. He has been a great, solid defensive, physical defenseman since he was drafted, and we're going to keep him there in Seattle. Now on to the Detroit Red Wings. We end up seeing the Seattle Kraken originally taking Dennis Cholowski. That is not going to be my pick today. I'm actually going to go for Vladislav Nemestikov, another player like Domi that we can add for some speed, for some offense there. And he's somebody that had a year left after that 2021 campaign with Detroit, would play another year being traded to Dallas eventually. But I think under bottom six, we'll have a role with Seattle. We'll keep him. And then we go on to the Edmonton Oilers, where originally the pick ended up being Adam Larsson. I tried to stay away from as many UFAs as possible, which is why there's not players like Michael Bunting, Jake McCabe, Dougie Hamilton, Zach Hyman picked. Adam Larsson, though, was really the big exception that Seattle had, where they took a UFA, ended up signing him, and that's exactly what we're going to still do. I think for Seattle, Adam Larsson has been a key defensive defenseman. We're going to keep him here on the squad. Now we move on to the Florida Panthers, and originally the Kraken ended up taking Chris Driedger, which at the time was a completely justified decision. The season before, he had a 927 save percentage as a backup, great numbers with Florida, but once he arrived at Seattle, there were some injury troubles, some inconsistencies, and just wasn't able to capture that. Instead, and this is probably one of the bigger hindsight picks, we're going to go for Brandon Montour and put him in Seattle immediately. Of course, the Kraken signed him this last offseason to a mega deal, but I think they could have had the power of Montour immediately. And this is the thing, back in 2021, he wasn't the player he was. He was decent with Buffalo, but of course, that was the last season that he would be with Buffalo. He arrived to Florida's system, and in a couple of years was one of the best offensive defensemen in the league, 73 points last year in 2023. We're going to bring him already to Seattle and fix that mistake. Going on to the LA Kings, the Kraken ended up taking Curtis McDermott. We're not going to do that. We're going to end up taking Jonathan Quick actually instead. And this might be a little bit galaxy brain, but I think Quick could have been decent as a mentor backup role. You can see in 2022, we put him a 910 save percentage. I think immediately could have been a solid goaltender. Obviously not on the level of a Marc-Andre Fleury in his first year of Vegas, but could have been decent there, riding the next wave of goaltenders as well. And I think could have been decent there. We'll see, but Quick would have been my starter, at least a start. Next up for Minnesota, they ended up going for Carson Soucy, which was a also completely justified pick and actually a pretty good one. He was solid with Seattle and ultimately went to Vancouver as well this last year. But I think instead I will go for Kaapo Kähkönen. We're going to get another goaltender on the squad here. And I think if Kähkönen was brought onto Seattle with the defense that we're building around him, I think he could have put some pretty big numbers up. In 2022, he put a 910 save percentage up in 25 games and was on his way to being a pretty good goaltender, but wasn't really able to realize that too much. He's now with Winnipeg, but we're going to keep him in Seattle for the long term. Next, we go into Montreal, and they ended up selecting Cale Fleury originally, who's actually still in the Kraken system, but most likely in AHLD for the foreseeable future. Instead, sneakily enough, we'll end up choosing Charlie Lindgren, and this to me is going to be a fascinating one to look back on. They had the chance at Lindgren, and he could have been really interesting in Seattle's system. I think originally he would have been the third string goalie, AHL starter to start out, but I think would have started to scrape his way to the NHL, getting more starts, getting more opportunities, opportunities, and as Jonathan Quick ages, we could see Lindgren become the full-time starter. He would have been really interesting in Seattle, and I think I'll spoil this by saying that Joey Daccord won't be on the team, but that's just because of some roster movements. I want to see some different ones, and you'll see later on who we end up taking from Ottawa instead, but I have Lindgren here as the starter. At least it would have been this last year. Now we go into Nashville, and originally they ended up picking Kyle Yarncroc, who was okay for Seattle. He put up 26 points in his first year in 49 games, but will be traded to Calgary later on in the season. Instead, I would have gone for Matt Duchene. Now, yes, his contract was insane, $8 million, but I think they needed to bring in some cap. They also need to bring in some offensive star power, and Duchene, you could argue at that point, wasn't that type of player. He had a pretty poor 2021, and I can understand why they didn't go after him, but in the next season, he put up 86 points, 43 goals with Nashville, and I think that offense was sorely missed in Seattle, and I think immediately would have been a first-line player for them. We're going to bring him onto the top 6. Now we keep going, and next up to the New Jersey Devils. This was honestly one of the worst situations from Seattle. They had to take Nathan Bastian, and I think that was honestly the best choice, even though he was horrible with Seattle and almost immediately got traded back to New Jersey. There was just slim pickings from New Jersey, man. It was horrible, and the fact that Bastian would still be my pick, I think speaks to that. Next we go on to the Islanders, and of course the Kraken originally selected Jordan Eberle. I will keep that pick as well. He's much needed goal scoring onto a Seattle team that will sorely need it, and even with the roster differences that I have in the foregroup, this still will need the offense, will need the power play ability. Eberle does bring that. Next up for the Rangers, they ended up selecting Colin Blackwell. Again, another team that doesn't really have the greatest options looking back on it. I think he did pretty well when he played there in 2022, getting 17 points in 39 games, but of course would be dealt to the Toronto Maple Leafs. I still think he could have been a useful extra forward, and that's about as good as you're going to get from the Rangers that year. Now we go to the Ottawa Senators, and this is another one that might be a little bit of a hot take. You have, of course, Joey Daccord as the original pick, and I would absolutely see why you'd want to go for that. But I think considering the forward options that were a part of Washington and a part of course, Minnesota with Capo Kakinen, I think the forward group is better because of the decisions we make here. Even though I don't choose Joey Daccord, I would have chosen Michael Amadio, who I think is one of the more underrated bottom sixers in the league. Ever since he was skipped on in 2021, he's put up some pretty great numbers with Vegas specifically. 16 goals in 2023, 14 goals in 2024. That type of depth, I think, will be especially important for the Seattle team, and Amadio, I think, will be a great piece there. Plus, I think Lindgren, if he was on Seattle this last year, might have put up similar numbers that Daccord did in terms of actual play. Lindgren was fantastic this last season, and I think between the two, it's a toss-up. But I think Amadio especially is an upgrade there. Next, we go on to the Kraken's pick from Philadelphia in Carson Twarnarski. I don't even understand. Nobody really understood this pick at the time, and it was a horrible one looking back on it. I mean, he was barely in their system whatsoever and left almost immediately. But I think instead, we're going to end up taking Shane Gostisbehere, who I thought was dealt before 2021, but after that was dealt to Arizona, where he put up some pretty good offensive numbers. But those power play abilities, they're 51 points, 14 goals. That would have been great in the first year for Seattle, so we're going to add Gostisbehere on as that power play quarterback. Now we go into Pittsburgh, and originally, of course, the Kraken ended up selecting fan favorite Brandon Tanev, and it hurts me to say, even though Tanev was a great pick, I think they could have gone even better and selected Evan Rodriguez of the Florida Panthers, and of course, the last Stanley Cup champions. He was a big part of that team. 15 points, 7 goals, 24 games. He's someone that since 2021, though, with Pittsburgh, with Colorado, with Florida, has just been so good in that speedy, versatile role, and he's going to fill that perfectly here with Seattle. Yes, Brandon Tanev would have been a bad loss, and character-wise would have been still a great pick, but Rodriguez, in terms of the actual player here, I think was the best option. Now moving on to the last rounds of picks here, we go on to the San Jose Sharks, where the Kraken ended up selecting Alexander True. I don't really know why. He played 8 games for them and wouldn't play again in the NHL, at least since 2022. Instead, we're going to go for Ryan Donato, who would actually find his way to the Seattle Kraken in the 2022 season, and he, to me, would have just been a pretty natural pick already, so we're just going to pick him to begin with. Next up, going into the St. Louis Blues, their pick ended up being Vince Dunn, and this has proven to be a fantastic pick from day one. It was the pretty obvious pick, but it was a great one as well. Since he was drafted by Seattle, he's just been so good in an offensive role. We're going to keep him and keep him doing his thing in Seattle. Another pick that we're actually going to keep here is the Tampa Bay Lightning, and they selected Yanni Gourde. To me, this was also a pretty great pick, and since then, he's just proven to be this great all-around centerman for Seattle. I think the offensive numbers, you maybe would have wanted to see a little bit more out of him, but still, the production has still been great. And for another pick that we're going to keep, we're going to go into the Toronto Maple Leafs, where the Kraken ended up selecting Jared McCann. This, to me, is a slam dunk. You could have also gone for Zach Hyman if you were more willing to sign UFAs, but I tried to limit as many many UFAs as possible. Jared McCann, though, was a brilliant pick and just continues to be, ever since being drafted by Seattle, exploded into this offensive product for the Kraken, and I absolutely love to see that. I mean, he's somebody that has just been so good, so consistent, and you got to keep that goal scoring. That offense is necessary. Next up, we're going to go on the Vancouver Canucks pick, and originally they ended up going for Cole Lind, which I absolutely saw why back then. He was somebody as a younger forward that was kind of on the cusp of breaking into the NHL. Didn't quite happen with Seattle or really any other team for that matter, but I think instead we're going to go for Jalen Chatfield, somebody that after that 2021 season was off the Vancouver system and went to Carolina, and over the past couple of years has developed into a pretty solid puck-moving D. He's somebody that I think, especially in Seattle, would have immediately been more of an extra defenseman AHL guy, but would have transitioned eventually to being in the NHL as a solid bottom pair piece. Now we go on to Washington, where the Kraken ended up selecting Vitek Vanacek, and of course, Vanacek would not end up playing for Seattle, and I think instead we're going to go for Garnet Hathaway. This, to me, I think also makes the Rodriguez instead of Tanev pick a lot more digestible. Obviously, Tanev is a fan favorite, but I think Hathaway would have pretty easily been too. With the bruising spirit that Hathaway has, he would have been a very solid bottom six piece immediately. You can see in 2022, he got 26 points, 14 goals. That was still his best season since then, and to me, I think would have been exactly what Seattle needed in the place of Tanev. And now going for our last pick of the evening. Next up, we go on to Winnipeg. Originally, they selected Mason Appleton, which was a fine pick. He was somebody that was okay with Seattle, but would end up being dealt back to the Winnipeg Jets eventually. Instead, we're going to go on the defensive side here, getting another right D and going for Dylan DeMello, who I still think is one of the most underrated defensemen in the NHL today. He's just so consistent, so good. And this last year, that was his best of his NHL career. 31 points in 82 games, and defensively, still rock solid. To me, he's exactly what Seattle could have really used, and he was kind of he could have been in the Justin Schultz cut type of mold, but I think a little bit more better immediately and would have still been a big part of their defense now, and that to me is the key. So putting all my picks together and what I would have done if I was Seattle, this is what I think the year one lineup would have looked like. A first line, Niederreiter, Gourde, and Matt Duchene. Second line of Jared McCann, Comfort, and Eberle, which I think would have been really interesting. A third line of Evan Rodriguez, Domi, and Garnet Hathaway. That could have been feisty. Nemestikov, Derek Ryan, and Fisher as the fourth line, and then you had all the other extras. Hinostroza, Bastian, Amadio, Blackwell, Donato. Amadio and Donato, especially over the next couple of years, would have been good pieces as well for Seattle as UFAs start to walk. On the defensive side, you got Vince Dunn, Adam Larson, Jamie Oleksiak, Brandon Montour, then Shane Gostisbehere, Dylan DeMello. And I love these pairs for one specific reason, and that's that every pair has good offense and good defense. You got Dunn as the offense, Larson as the defense, Oleksiak as the defense, Montour as the offense, and then Gostisbehere as the offense, DeMello as the defense. And to me, I think that consistency, that separation, and just the depth throughout the lineup is just really solid. And that's not even counting players like Will Borgen, also Jalen Chatfield, that would have factored in the defense eventually. And then you got the goaltending, which I guess you could argue, at least to start out, was maybe the weakest part about it. But of course, Jonathan Quick had a solid 2022. I think he would have done the same in Seattle. Kaapo Kähkönen would have also been there, and Charlie Lindgren could have also burst out of the scene if he really wanted to. I think Lindgren would be the starter now, but Quick would have been the starter at the start. And you could maybe make the case that that was the biggest weakness, but already for Seattle, Grubauer was just not it. And I think you couldn't have really gotten much worse than he has been for Seattle. And I think Quick, honestly, might have been an improvement. But that's gonna be it for today, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell. Comment down below what you guys thought of my picks, what you guys agree, what you guys disagree with, and how you would redraft the Seattle Kraken expansion draft down below. Share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. And of course, check out BetUS in the description down below to make your own picks on the NHL. And I will see you guys in the next one. Have a fantastic day and goodbye.